Welcome to Funny, They Don't Look Jewish, where Judaism appears in the panels. Our purpose is to find characters, stories, and issues of comics that explore explicitly Jewish content.
And I'm Brandon Bernstein. No relation.
Okay, hello, DC Comics, we're back.
Hello, Henry. We are back in the world of DC Comics.
2 shows in a row in DC land.
Really incredible. And just with love to my Marvel side, I mentioned this to you before recorded, but yesterday was the finale of X-Men 97, and I've just been in such a Marvel happy place. I'm very happy to move over, happy to talk DC, but just want to give a quick shout out of how happy I am. But as you said, DC and more Golem.
Yeah, we're doing more Batman issues, right?
I wish, because those were very good. I would love to go back to them.
Yeah.
So for the first time ever, Funny They Don't Look Jewish rehashes the same comics that we covered last. No, Henry, we have to go on. There is more Jewish content to be unearthed and uncovered for our listeners, and that means exploring the Golem to the more wretched parts of the earth, I suppose.
I guess, yeah. We're gonna cover some comics.
But before we do, we want to be able to point out we're covering today really like 2 different comics or comic storylines, and then an episode of a TV. And there's a strange through line that they all have in addition to the Golem. They all seem to have, Henry, the Golem either related to the Holocaust and German Nazis or related to white super, but one way or another, we keep seeing the Golem in relationship with the Holocaust or the Golem in relationship with Nazis. And I just thought before we dive in, I think it's really important. Henry, why do we think the Golem keeps coming up with this Holocaust stuff? Why are these 2 aspects, one of Jewish history and one of Jewish mythology, why do they keep coming up together in the realm of comics?
I have a couple thoughts about it. One is generous, one is maybe not as generous, but they're sort of based on the same thing. And that's, I think in modern popular culture, unfortunately, as a note in history, the Holocaust is probably the most well-known Jewish event. As much as that sucked, it certainly in the 20th century, or since the 20th century. And so that's just like a frame of reference for when you're going to do a story that involves Judaism, unfortunately. Secondly, we're dealing with comic books, and what's more, we can use that in a story. It's just like built, that story of the Golem is built for comics. And I think on the one hand, it's just, that's how it is. So they're going to mush those 2 together because it just works. It's kind of, and I say that both as let's just go with what works and what we know about Jews, and so we'll put it in a comic. And it's kind of super lazy to do that, and not explore other things about Judaism in connection to a Golem or the Holocaust. I mean, I guess we've seen plenty of Holocaust stuff that had nothing to do with the Golem. The question is why Golem means Holocaust.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you just framed it exactly right. And I also want to say, like, on a larger level, boy, I'm so glad that it's, we've had 29 episodes before this, and it's only on episode 30 that we're really diving into, like, why does the Golem keep coming up with the Holocaust? Because can you imagine if we were starting this entire enterprise,
right,
and it was, oh, it turns out most of comic book depictions of Judaism are the Holocaust? It would be such a bummer. It would be such a sort of, even though, as you said, right, I was struck as you were talking about that sort of long-standing depiction of this very well-known event, right? I often think, and I think we've even mentioned the book before on the show, I think about that book, We Spoke Out, Comic Books and the Holocaust, which Neil Adams co-authored. Media genres or media, one of the first sort of like mediums, I suppose is what I'm trying to say, to actually address the Holocaust and talk about it in popular culture. Even Mouse, which is sort of revered as the story, that comes out in 86, right? Pre Mouse, there's not as much talk, right? We know that in Israeli society, the generation of survivors coming out of the Holocaust didn't want to talk about their experience at first. There was a lot of quiet. And so I think comics became this early space, and in some ways, I don't know, it made this sort of inexorable link between comic books and the Holocaust. It became a good place to depict it.
Right. Well, also, the Holocaust is completely tied up with World War II, which is essentially at the birth of comic
Yeah,
books, of
100, or at
superhero
least
comic books.
superhero comic books. Yeah,
Superman literally did contribute to the US winning the war. Because of Superman comics, people bought war bonds, and that helped America win the war.
right,
Like
right.
that's what happened. So they are forever linked, I think, that way. And so that's where I was thinking, like, on the one hand, okay, well, what are we going to do about it? That's fine. On the other hand, is it kind of lazy?
Right. I mean, I think getting to your question before of why, whenever the golem pops up, do we seem to have neo Nazis or the Holocaust? And the best I could offer is, we looked at some of Gershom Scholem's work and the evolution of the golem, from just sort of this reference in the Talmud or various midrashim, and then all the way to sort of Kabbalistic texts describing how to create the golem. That's all the sort of esoteric and highly intellectual text referring to this concept of creating a life. But the golem legend doesn't really get legs until the story sort of spreads around the Maharal of Prague, right? Making a golem. Why? To protect the Jewish community. And I think that legacy as a protector of the Jewish community means that the golem always has to come up, at least in popular imagination, when the Jews are threatened. And in modern day, and in the comics we're seeing, the easiest way to indicate a threat against the Jews, I suppose, would be the Nazis, the Holocaust, modern day white supremacists, right? Like, we don't live in a time of pogroms anymore. We don't live in a time of Jews being kicked out of Spain in 1492. Like, the modern version of hating Jews and Jews being in danger is anti-Semitism. So I guess it makes sense that if the golem is meant to be a protector of the Jewish people need a threat. And so the easiest way for a comic book writer to do that is, well, the threat must be Nazis or the Holocaust or the descendants of Nazis trying to redo that work. Therefore, it's fitting for a golem to come and protect the Jews.
So I completely agree with you. Do you think that's good, bad, or indifferent? Like, is that a good thing? So we like sort of stated why that is, or why we think that is.
Yeah.
What is
I
what is the value you place on it? What is the judgment you place on that thing?
I mean, in general, I try not to judge too much one way or another, even though I get you're just saying like value wise. I think like
Right. I don't mean like
for
judge, like be
no, I
judgy.
understand.
Yeah.
I think for Jews, like the concept of the golem as a defender is a beautiful thing. I have mentioned to you before that I'm a big fan of the artwork of Isaac Bringard Bialik, right, who goes by the name Nice Jewish Artist on Instagram and in other places. And he got popular for this work of visual midrash or paper midrash, where he would combine images cut out from comic books with books from the Geniza that were going to be buried anyway, and he like brings together excerpts from Torah and from Sidurim and sort of brings them together with comic books and creates these stunning images, right? So there's like an
Wait, he
incredible,
does like mixed media?
it's mixed media, and so he'll cut
Oh.
out an image from a comic and then he'll cut out words from a Siddur and bring them together and fit them into this etching. So like there's a really cool one he did that was the burning bush with images of the Human Torch doing flame on, right? It's like cool stuff like that, where it's this mixed
Oh.
together. And
What's his
during
name?
the Isaac Bringard Bialik, I could be wrong, but I think he's Mayim Bialik's brother.
Oh.
Very cool guy. I have reached out to him, and hopefully the next time I'm in California, I want to meet up with him because he's a very cool guy. But he did a whole series in the early pandemic of these mixed media visual midrash golems, because he was like, there's a pandemic, we need protection, and so he made this series of like superhero golems. And so there's like a Hulk aesthetic golem and a Thing aesthetic golem and all these like heroes that look like a golem as sort of these like like round, not misshapen, but sort of like clods of clay. They look so cool. So from that perspective, from the idea of like outside of comic books, Jews having a hero, the idea of the golem as the defender, I think is a really powerful and cool concept.
That's
Within
awesome.
comic, yeah, within comic books, and especially when it comes from non-Jewish writers, I just find, and maybe it's because we're looking at so many of them in a row, I'm getting a little bored. As you said earlier, it feels a little lazy and not as interesting. Like having a golem and having the golem defend against white supremacists or neo Nazis or actual Nazis, like fine, but at this point I've seen it so many times. It doesn't feel
Right.
as rich
Right.
as, I've never read the novel, but I know there's that novel like The Golem and the Djinn, or the right about like a golem and a genie immigrating to America and the relationship.
Right.
That seems way more interesting to me than just like, oh, Nazis, Golem's going to protect us again. Golem goes out of control. Turns
Right.
out hate is bad no matter what.
And also, well, I think also because like we read a really, really good one, right? Like the Batman one, which had all of those
Yes.
things in it. It had the neo-Nazis, it had a good depiction of
Yes.
Golem, it had a complicated Golem creator and like morally complicated. It had Batman dealing with his own moralities, right? So when you get really, really good story of that thing,
Yeah.
it's hard to see just more of it when it's already been done well. It's like, okay, well, what about something else?
Absolutely. It feels like diminishing returns, sort of similar to,
Yeah,
and it's ironic because, Ragman was associated with the Golem in some of the comics we read. And right, like those first Ragman issues that show how what his relationship was to the Warsaw Ghetto and the way that the rags were used to defend, like that was so cool. And then it felt like every comic since repeated that mythos without adding to it. And so it just
yeah,
again felt like, wait, we've seen this before. So it's similar that like those Batman issues from 1991 were incredible.
right.
And I don't know that what we're covering today adds anything particularly new or insightful. I don't know if it adds to the conversation. It feels like it's a rehash of the conversation. And like, not every comic can be groundbreaking. That's
Right,
okay.
right.
But it's a little disappointing. I'd love to ask you, Henry, the other big question,
Hmm.
because really for some of the issues we're covering, I think it comes up like, we have committed to covering explicit Jewish content. And sometimes my favorite is when we cover an issue with like a Jewish
Explicitly
wedding or,
Jewish content.
yes, sorry, explicitly Jewish content. This is not adults only 18 plus on Jewish content, but explicitly Jewish, like spoken. So I love the holidays and the ritual stuff, but every now and then we cover things that involve Nazis, like we are today. So to what degree does anti-Semitism itself or Jew hate itself constitute explicitly Jewish content?
Right.
Is somebody hating Jews, like, do we in our show, I know we can make up whatever answer we want, but like, do we have an obligation to cover anything? Like, if there's no other Jewish content other than the fact that there's Nazis as the bad guys and they're espousing Jew hatred, do we have an obligation to cover that? Is that explicitly Jewish content? So, just repeating
Yeah.
it again, and I realize I'm talking a lot, but to what degree does anti-Semitism and Jew hatred constitute explicitly Jewish content?
I think it starts to get closer to implicit Jewish content. I would say, I think if we're looking at it, let's say a flashback and there's a helicopter, there's like a bird's eye view. Think of the opening scene of X-Men, right?
Right.
Okay. Is that, I would say at that point, that kind of stuff, like that, not including, it's explicit, sorry, getting a little excited. X-Men, the movie, the opening scene of X-Men is explicitly Jewish content because it was the first time they ever did anything like that in a superhero movie. But that scene in a vacuum with like zoomed out, you're seeing just people marching you see Arbeit macht frei, right? I would say that's not necessarily explicitly Jewish content at this point. After
Right.
knowing
Right.
what we know now and covering what we've covered, I think it's not. I think it's getting closer to implicit, or maybe it's just Jewish content adjacent. Like I
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it really, first of all, let me respond to the specific, and then I'll get like larger.
Mhm.
You're right. You have me thinking now about X-Men First Class, where we once again get a flashback to Magneto's youth in the Holocaust. But then, right, I loved the beginning of that movie when we basically got young Magneto Nazi Hunter.
It
What
was
a fun
sick.
and
Yeah.
stimulating thing to watch. Is that Jewish content? Or explicitly Jewish content? I'd argue probably not,
No.
because he was certainly a survivor, but it never delved into Magneto's Judaism. And I guess I'll just acknowledge, if you've been listening to us from the beginning, you're probably like, "There's a major Jewish character you
I know.
haven't
When
covered.
are
His
these
name is
guys?
Magneto."
When are these guys
um,
gonna get to Magneto already?
and it's like I have a
We've only
document
been
of
talking
so
about
many
it for 4
notes.
years, so any
Yeah,
day now.
yeah, any day now. So look, we have plans for a Magneto episode. We're going to be we haven't forgotten him. It's more like he's such a rich character that he's going to deserve a very special kind of episode. So we're going to get there. But the point being, like, so much of Magneto's character in the comics and others, like the Holocaust is foundational, and yet he never engages with his Jewish identity otherwise, and that makes it really difficult.
Right.
On the larger point that you were making, I'm really interested in this question because as someone who works in the Jewish world, I find that I occasionally meet people where it feels like the most prominent aspect of their Jewish identity is remembering the Holocaust, right? Like that is the center of what it is. And so
Huh.
it's remembering the right, like there are Pew studies that show that when interviewed, like so many Jews, out of ranking all these aspects of like what's the most important part of being a Jew, like even more than going to synagogue, more than keeping kosher, more than celebrating the holidays, more than family, right? Remembering the Holocaust is like the number one thing. And so I, as a rabbi who's engaged in Jewish life, don't want to become uninviting to anyone for whom that is the center of their Jewish identity. And yet I'm really invested in building new and exciting Jewish things and not just remembering our trauma, even though I very much think that there's an importance in learning lessons from the Holocaust, remembering it. Like we obviously cannot forget. And when that becomes like the center, when that becomes Jewish content in itself, I just have a lot of questions about what that means. And so, similarly, right, like when we see Jewish hate, Jewish suffering, Nazis, etc., to call it explicitly Jewish content feels wrong. I think we're in agreement about that, but I'm looking at the sort of larger implications of it.
Yeah, I think at this point of where we are now, we've seen it's like we've seen too much. That we've seen it all. We've given 30 examples of this idea, right?
Yeah,
You know, more, but you know what I mean.
yeah,
So I think at this point, the Holocaust depictions of the Holocaust in a comic book aren't necessarily explicitly Jewish content. They probably should be discussed because they're there, and like you said, it's just a part of it. It's just a part of the story. But it is, I think, when we've seen meaningful things like the things bar mitzvah and Jewish wedding, at this point, the Holocaust as being the only Jewish content, I think yeah, I think it's wearing on me.
yeah, yeah. Well, I'm in agreement, and it's funny. Like we kind of debated back and forth: should we have this conversation before covering the issues or after? Um, and it'll be interesting because I think now what we want to do is kind of switch gears. Like we've had the meta conversation, the bird's eye view, and now we're going to dive in, and maybe we'll come back to these questions at the end of the episode once we have these examples, so our listeners can know what we mean when we say, there's the golem, there's Jewish content, but the majority of the Jewish content sometimes feels like it's the anti-Semitism, and we'll see how that goes. So, Henry, what are we looking at first today?
All right. Well, today we are looking at Swamp Thing, Volume 2, number 153, April 1995. The story is River Run, Chapter 2, Twilight of the Gods, written by Mark Millar, penciled by Chris Weston, inked by Kim DeMulder, colored by Tatjana Wood, lettered by Comicraft, and edited by Stuart Moore and Julie Rottenberg.
Yes, here we are in the world of Swamp Thing, which I don't think we've ever covered Swamp Thing before.
I think
Um,
so.
and Henry, you wanted to point out also, we've never covered Mark Miller before.
Yeah. Yeah, I asked you before we hit record, have we ever, I mean, every now and then we get to like an iconic writer, and because we sort of started this whole thing with like Brian Michael Bendis, and it sort of felt
And
like we're out,
yeah,
and we've always had good writers here, but his writing was certainly, for better or for worse, seminal, like, focal point of my comic reading in the 90s and early 2000s. So it's interesting
absolutely. I was
to
first
cover him.
familiar with him in the early 2000s with Ultimate X-Men and seeing
Mhm.
what he wrote there, and then
Mhm.
his Wolverine run, Enemy of the State. So you've been familiar with Mark Millar for a while. This is a little earlier in his career because we're looking in 1995, way before the Millarverse that he created of Kick-Ass and all those other characters. Yeah, and like I don't even want to touch his current state or reputation. A couple things I want to say about the Swamp Thing issues we're diving in. Basically, my understanding is Mark Millar took over Swamp Thing after Grant Morrison, who is just an absolute legend. I love their work so much. So Mark Millar takes over and he's writing. This is the second story arc. It's an extended storyline called River Run. And the overall storyline is one in which Swamp Thing has encountered a woman named Anna. Anna is trapped in her own unpublished book of short stories called River Run, and each story takes place on a different parallel Earth. And so Swamp Thing needs to travel from parallel Earth to parallel Earth to like save Anna's life by like making an impact on each one of them. It's basically Mark Millar's excuse to play in the world of Elseworlds, and he's going around and going to a lot of different parallel realities. Mark Millar loves Elseworlds. I mean, I don't blame him. I love Elseworlds. For anyone who doesn't know, DC's basically version of What If. These are like out of continuity stories in alternate worlds. This particular issue, chapter 2, Twilight of the Gods, the name might already hint to you, right? Like I hear Twilight of the Gods and immediately my mind goes to Richard Wagner and his music, right? And so unfortunately, when I think of Wagner as a composer, I also think like, oh, Nazis love
Yeah,
him. And
Hitler's
indeed,
favorite composer, right?
yeah, yeah. So we're in a Nazi-filled story because this is taking place in what DC dubs Earth X. And Earth X, I was looking up, Henry, it actually first appeared way back in October 1973 in
Mhm.
Justice League of America number 107. And it is a parallel Earth where Germany won World War II.
Mhm.
And therefore, Nazism has spread globally because Germany became the world superpower. Marvel has its own version of like comic companies love the idea of the alternate world where the Germans won and the world's all
Right.
fascistic Nazis.
I think all writers love that. I mean, I never watched it, but because of the subject matter, but like the Man in the High Castle, that show, and
Yeah.
like people love that stuff. I personally don't. I find it really scary to even think about, and I don't like it disturbs me to see it in entertainment. I even in DC stuff. Like I and it,
Yeah.
like I first was introduced to Earth X and the Crisis of Infinite Earths. And that's why I'm, by the way, I'm a little confused about what's happening here because it's 1995, which means that it's 10 years after Crisis on Infinite Earths, and there's only one Earth. So I don't understand how they're in Earth X, but
Well, again, I think
maybe
because it's
Swamp
like,
Thing has the ability to, I don't know.
yeah, I think it's because, again, in this over, like, I haven't read the other issues, but from what I've gathered, I think Miller wanted to be able to play with the other Earths that no longer existed. And so the conceit was this woman, Anna, wrote a book of short stories in which each short story takes place in a weird
Oh,
parallel Earth.
okay.
So, like, this is the same Earth, but also, like, it's within the context of her short story.
Got it.
And therefore,
Okay.
Swamp Thing can visit it.
Fine.
Um,
Okay. I'll
gotta
accept
love
that
all the
answer, Red.
fine, like, yeah, you gotta have the like the fine details of how do we make the continuity work, how do we make the halacha work, right?
Yeah.
My favorite Jewish comic comparisons. But on, we're only going to cover the bits that we really feel are important. So on page 6, we are indeed in what is this Nazified Earth's 1995, where the Fuhrer is, I guess, either the son or the grandson of Adolf Hitler, a
Right.
guy named Alois Hitler.
I didn't know how to pronounce it. Yeah.
Alois Hitler, who mentions that there is a Golem project. And he says, we should never forget that the Golem is a Yiddish legend. The Jews hoped this spirit would arise in their darkest hour, and we should be thankful it did not. Invoking such old magic now is foolish. So basically, he knows that in the Nazified America, the U.S. president has started this like Golem project. We're going to learn more about it. Um, but yeah, interesting. Like there's a Yiddish legend, as he's saying, the idea of again the golem as a protective spirit, as a protector of the Jews rising their darkest hour. So it's immediately playing in with the themes we discussed at the top of the episode, right? Of like a golem defending the Jews. But this is a world where it didn't happen, but they're messing with it. And this is also going to play into something that I've seen more and more of lately, which is, there's so much Jewish mystical content that can be Jewish, but it also gets picked up in like occultism and sort of
Right.
the
We've
world
talked about that.
non-Jewish occultism. But you're zooming in right now. Our readers can't, our listeners can't see it, but I love this. In this world, Henry, who is the Fuhrer married to?
The Fuhrer is married to Norma Jean Baker, and which is Marilyn Monroe. That's her real name.
Yeah,
And so I actually have to give credit to some great Millar writing here, is that you don't even have, he doesn't give you much more information about her, but your mind sort of accepts that Marilyn Monroe didn't die and in fact married the Hitler's grandson or son.
right.
And it's just like you can go wherever you want with that. That's actually an interesting idea, especially because it has nothing to do with Jews. The reason why I don't like Earth X as a concept, because it implies to me, if you're saying that the Germans won World War II, then you're saying the Nazis won the Holocaust, which means there are no more Jews in the, like,
That
the
seems to be
concept
the
of Earth X
implication. Yeah.
ignores, every time I've seen Earth X, like the Crisis on Infinite Earths TV show, like they never mention, at least from my understanding, please correct me if I'm wrong, if you know a good Earth X story where they mention this, but from my understanding, I've never seen an Earth X story where the Jews are mentioned, but the implication of it, of the Earth's existence, is that there are no more Jews. And I just don't accept that. I don't like that. And I don't want to think about it, even if it's a villainous world that's horrible. Like even like the Earth that has Ultraman and the Crime Syndicate. I think
Yeah.
it's Earth 3. There's nothing about that. It's just that the supervillains control the world in a sort of Hitler-esque way. But there's nothing,
Right.
the implications of Nazis winning means there are no more Jews. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, I guess I agree with you. It's like I feel like writers don't even want to really touch that because of the implication of how gross it is, right? Like
Right.
what are the populations that no longer exist? Marvel has its own version that's kind of gross. Like in the Excalibur comics, there's a world where the Nazis have taken over because the Captain Britain Corps has connection to all the different multiverses. And from what I remember, and one thing that's really disturbing is like Shadowcat, the very Jewish Shadowcat who we've covered, has a Nazi equivalent, and I think she's uh, gosh, I haven't. Excalibur is one of my blind spots. I like know of it. I never really read the original run, but I think if I remember correctly, all the other members of Excalibur are Nazis, and Shadowcat might be like a slave or sort of like a Jewish ghost or something. It's just like really macabre
Yeah, I
and
don't
not
like that.
cool. Do not like it. So let's not spend too much time here. On page 9, the only
By
thing
the
we
way,
need to
this
know.
started as me complimenting Mark Millar's
Yeah.
writing for the Marilyn
Oh,
Monroe bit.
well, because it's like it's an interesting. Also, like just to make sure it's named right, like the idea of Marilyn Monroe, the like blonde Hollywood starlet, being the sort of like Nazi ideal to marry. Like, yeah, makes sense.
It's actually brilliant. It's one of his more
Right.
brilliant things. That's where he
Yeah.
shines, when he does weird
Yeah.
stuff like that.
Right. So, page 9, we get confirmation that the golem is operational, and on page 11, we finally get to meet the golem, and it is one of the most incredibly striking images ever as we
So cool.
see basically Swamp Thing diving in here. Swamp Thing traveling into the body of this golem, and it looks like Swamp Thing with this like blue shoulder pads and a
Hmm.
blue helmet and armor and this Magen David on his chest, and it's just like I don't know,
It's
it's like all of
awesome.
a sudden a Jewified Swamp Thing.
It's super cool. It's because it takes the silliness of those like armor things that we've seen in other versions of the Golem, like Der Golem, the 1920 film, where it has like that weird hat. We've seen the
Yeah,
helmet and stuff at this point. And you'd think in Swamp Thing, which is both a completely supernatural, but also it's like highly realistic because of its adult content. Like you'd think it would be ridiculous to see to see Swamp Thing dressed in this stuff, but it's kind of cool.
yeah, it's kind of neat. And like obviously that does mean that we have like swamp plant golem as opposed to clay golem. And
Right. That's
on
different.
page 12, they inform us and they let us know this golem body was not created through traditional clay, but rather through plant-based fractal organisms, which is what allows Swamp Thing to connect through it. Swamp Thing communes with the green
Mhm.
and with various things. And then the U.S. president says It's hard to believe it just took one word from the Kabbalah to summon you here. Just
Hmm.
one magic word from a little book in the forbidden library. Emeth, the Hebrew word for truth.
Another forbidden library.
Yeah, absolutely. Once again, we get, we always get the like, I wish they'd give us specifics on what they mean by the Kabbalah. Mark Millar is doing the typical UK thing, which is using the occult spelling. Like in Spanish transliteration, I see Kabbalah with a C, but mostly in English it's with a K,
Yeah.
unless you're talking occult, and then Kabbalah is always like with a C and a singular B instead of a K and a double B. So it's like it's funny when I see Kabbalah like that, I'm always like, oh, not Jewish Kabbalah.
Yeah. I didn't know that was a thing in you probably see Kabbalah because you read and see horror stuff. So you probably see Kabbalah in other contexts
Yeah, there's
more than
like
I do.
it's really interesting. Like Al Ewing brings a lot of it up, especially the idea of the Qliphote, which are these like dark other side to the Spherote. And like, yeah, occultism goes wild with this stuff. Satanists like to go wild with this kind of stuff. There's a lot of imagination around this. Yeah, so this is an interesting form. We've seen the idea before that, right? Like when we covered the Batman story, right? We had our golem creator constantly having to sort right like he had to say each letter of the alphabet in conjunction with each letter of God's name, the tetragrammaton with the different vowels, and it took like all this concentration. And here it's like we just needed to say one little word to summon the golem. Just say Emmet. That was it. Which is like, all right, I guess like let the Kabbalah be magic in this world.
Right,
Fine.
right.
So on page 14, the president is talking to the Swamp Thing golem and says, like, you're the golem, aren't you? The Jewish spirit of vengeance? It said so in the Kabbalah. Once again, Kabbalah, this whole genre of literature, treated as though it's just like, yeah, like the book, the Kabbalah. Where in the Kabbalah are you talking, Mr. President? But I couldn't find anything in like golem literature that we have calling it the Jewish spirit of vengeance, but I love it because it
Yeah,
sounds like a Jewish ghost rider or a
right.
Jewish specter. Yeah.
Right, right. When we were looking at these, uh, a few weeks ago, and you read that the Jewish spirit of vengeance, and you were like look, Ghost Rider, and I was like, or like Spectre, like you're
Yeah,
like
yeah.
yes, they both. We
It's
already have a
amazing.
spirit of vengeance, and this is the Jewish
Right.
spirit of vengeance.
Yeah, this one's the Jew. I'm the Jewish member of the Legion of Superheroes.
Yeah.
So uh, basically, the president indicates that the golem is like an access point to the spirit world. And this is something that I was going to bring up at the end, but I might as well bring it up now. Like, it's interesting. I haven't gone into it too much in detail, but apparently, Henry, one other place where golems keep appearing, not just in the occult and not just in Jewish lit myth, but did you know that golem was a very common term in earlier editions of the role playing game Dungeons and Dragons and its lore?
Oh, really?
Yes, apparently the golem was defined in early D&D lore as magical constructs generally moved by an earth spirit. And the idea in D&D is that you could have different golems of different types. So you could have like a clay golem, but I think you could also have a flesh golem. Like they were sort of the game that introduced the idea that you could make the golem out of different materials.
Collect them all.
Yeah, exactly. In like contemporary D&D, like in 5th edition and beyond, and also in like, the year 2024 and generally there's been some more like awareness, like there's a lot of D&D players kind of being like it's actually inappropriate of us to use the term golem. It's a very specific Jewish mythological creature and we shouldn't be using it to describe these like evil automatons that are used in the D&D games. So
Mm.
I think they're switching it over to construct. But the reason I brought it up is I need to do some more research, and listeners, if you know, please let me know. It feels like that's what Millar is playing with, this idea that a golem doesn't have to be made out of clay, is some sort of spirit, which could be the Jewish spirit of vengeance, but some other spirit that inhabits the body. And once again, you can feel the shift is like just talking about the golem mythos in that way. It's edging its way more to occultism. It doesn't feel as Jewish, right? It's not about the Hebrew letters. It's this Jewish spirit. Like you can see the way it's being like brought into like an occult or Christian milieu as opposed to the specifically Jewish one. But back to our story. We get a twist on page 15 as the president is using the Golem project and actually wants to use it to destroy the planet. Because in this world, he feels like what happened was like the Holocaust wasn't appropriate and like the world deserves to die for its sins, essentially. And he's asking Swamp Thing to destroy the place. But Swamp Thing wants to consider whether or not he should, because it feels a little like Sodom and Gomorrah to me. Like, will Swamp Thing in the spirit of, I mean, Spectre is probably a good comparison at this point,
Right.
right? Because it's like, the Spectre is God's spirit of vengeance. So in this case, Swamp Thing is contemplating, should I destroy this entire world? And on page 19, we get Swamp Thing revealing his decision, and he's in the water and lets the president know that no one should suffer for the sins of their fathers, and one Holocaust does not justify another. In other words, Swamp Thing's decided like they're living in an ecological paradise under Nazi rule, and therefore, like, why should Swamp Thing mess it up, set it up, or destroy them just because of the awful things they did there? Which is like, it feels like such a gross philosophy of the ends justify the means. Like, who cares that it's a world where every single Jew has died? Because now the planet lives in, which also, like, what anti-Semitism is underneath that? That like, oh, the only thing preventing us from living in a perfect world of harmony is the Jews being around, right?
Right.
Like
Right.
that's fine.
Cleansing the
It's
Jews.
really
Yeah.
gross. It's really gross. So on page 20, the president wipes away the first letter from the forehead, leaving Met. The golem's gone forever. The president acknowledges it's the Hebrew word for death, the opposite of truth. I thought that was interesting.
Is death the opposite of truth?
So the only thing that I was thinking about is truth is often known, right, throughout various midrashic and Talmudic sort of references. Like, truth is God's seal, emet is God's seal, right? And that's like partly the idea that emet is the first letter, the last letter, the middle letter of the alphabet, right? It's like the idea is like God is on the side of truth.
Mhm.
And biblically, there's a lot of references to the idea that like God is a living God. God is a God of life. God is not death. That to die is to be away from God. In fact, in Psalm 115, verse 17, we get the famous Lo hametin hallelujah. The dead do not praise God. Right? There are various psalms in which the psalmist is saying, like, don't let me die, God. You don't want me dead because the dead don't get to sing your praises. They don't get to be connected. So in that way, if truth is God's seal and death is distance from God, in that way, I guess death is like the opposite of truth.
Okay, I'll accept that.
Sure. So on page 23, Swamp Thing has left this world behind. The US president is meeting with the Fuhrer and comments that he's pretty sure they didn't summon the real golem. It was just an elemental spirit. Again, getting into the sort of D&D lore. And Alois Hitler is now worried and is like, well, you dispose of the body properly, right? Because if not, he's concerned that the real golem spirit may show up and fill the body now, apparently just erasing the E of Emeth or the Aleph, whatever it's meant to be.
Mhm.
And the story ends with indeed the true golem possesses the body and basically rains death upon every single person, and the world comes to an end. Which, like, that last page does a lot to kind of be like, oh, okay, good. Mark Millar isn't advocating for the idea of the Nazis would be okay if they get like it's showing that there needs to be some vengeance. And I think overall, Millar's whole Swamp Thing run was about showing how detached Swamp Thing is from humanity. So like we're meant to not be happy with his decision. But yeah, that's the story. Henry, how do you feel about this issue we just ran through?
I Other than the image of Swamp Thing as the golem, I hated it. As I said it before, I the entire premise of Earth X disturbs me and I don't like it. The and it just didn't do anything for me. I think even, other than that image of that says MF, I I think could make an argument that this isn't explicit Jewish comment. Like I was looking at, that last page that we covered, page 20. If you're just looking at it and looking away, you're not seeing anything Jewish, just the opposite, in fact. So, as maybe we're going along, maybe like the golem itself as a concept doesn't automatically get a pass as explicitly Jewish content.
Right. But, it mentions the golem is from Yiddish legend. It's supposed to defend the Jews. It's a Jewish spirit of vengeance. The Kabbalah lets you create it, right? Like there
Mhm.
are elements of Jewish content in there. And the other thing The other thing we didn't cover, and it's funny because we usually do, we often talk about striking covers at the beginning. And I think this issue of Swamp Thing Volume 2, number 153, that we just covered, one of the most famous things about it, or infamous things about it, is its cover, which is a Brian Boland cover. It's incredibly striking, but it's Swamp Thing like draped across a giant swastika in the colors of the American flag. And so once again, right, it's like, well, that's a Nazi thing. That's not Jewish content, obviously. But it's sort of like a semi-controversial cover. It's definitely like attracted certain criticism. It's a very bold choice to have that.
That was what I was going to ask. Is it a famous cover? Like, had you recognized it when you saw it?
I definitely had seen it before, and I think if you like look for this single issue, it's more expensive than the average back issue of the time. So yeah, I think I don't know. I would love to look into it more. I don't know if it got like if fewer issues were published because of controversy around it. I have no idea, but it's definitely a known cover.
Wow. I hated it. By the way, I know I love Brian Boland, but like,
Yeah, yeah. Well, Henry, you are going to hate what we look at next even more because we're officially going to be covering Hellblazer number 167. We'll get there in a moment because it has some Jewish golem content. But this is part four of a storyline called Highwater. And Henry, you didn't look at it, but I read all four parts. And this is really what prompted the question for me of, is it Jewish content if we're looking at really gross anti-Semitism? So, Henry, I'm going to walk you through the first three issues and some of
okay,
the horrific anti-Semitism in it,
awesome. Can't
and
wait.
you get to, yeah, I know. In part one, Hellblazer 164, we get the narration from some sort of preacher throughout. In all these issues, we're going to get them. It's basically a woman named Marjorie, who is the widow of one of Constantine's friends, and this guy named Mr. Gage, who's involved in the local group of neo Nazis. And we're going to discover over the course of the storyline that Marjorie is down with the neo Nazi cause. We hate her. But on page 13 of this, she is giving like this sermon, and she says, I'm just going to read it to you, Henry. God cast Cain out of the garden, meaning he was forced to roam the land, and he was bearing a mark, meaning that he was physically different, meaning he was the first Jew, meaning that he was the father of an evil race dedicated to the destruction of the pure white bloodline of Adam. Right. So, yeah, your eyes just widen so much. Like, this is what's going on. It's like the grossest anti Semitism and white supremacy of like the Jews are evil. Like, Cain is the first Jew, that they're marked different, which I assume would be circumcision, and they're forced to wander. They're a wandering people. Like, horrific, right?
Holy, you know what? Oh my
Yeah.
God.
We didn't do like the whole thing, but this whole thing is written by Brian Azzarrello, who generally has such an ear for dialogue. I loved his run on 100 Bullets. Great writer. As I'm looking at this and I'm looking back, I'm like, was 100 Bullets really edgelord? And I just didn't notice when I read it at the time because
It's
this issue has me
Lord.
a little concerned. Then in the first part, also on like page 23, unsurprisingly, this group of neo Nazis were also, they're pro Confederacy, and they're talking about why the Confederacy lost. And the Confederacy lost to the US, which they described as ZOG. Henry, do you know what ZOG means when reference to the US? That it's a Zionist occupational government,
Hmm.
which is weird because they say that happened, in 1865, right, or like in the 1860s, which at the end of the Civil War, pretty sure that's a little before Zionism really came into being as a political philosophy. All right,
Yes, by a few years.
a few years. In Hellblazer number 165, we get one of the characters referencing that, they have to support these white men because, quote, they have no voice in the Jew controlled media. So once again, we get a lot of Jewish stereotypes going on. And then this group of neo Nazis is going to buy guns from an arms dealer who goes by the Wolf Man. They don't like the Wolfman because the Wolfman sells to anyone who's willing to pay, which means he's willing to pay to white people and black people. And these group of white supremacist idiot assholes decide they don't like him because he's willing to sell to black people. Obviously, Azzarello's point is to show how odious these people are, but it's just like, it's so gross to read.
Right.
The Wolfman is selling them guns, and he indicates that they're Israeli made guns. To which these neo-Nazis are like, these are Jew guns, and they start to not want it. And on page 16, Wolfman is like needling them and basically says, are they bothered by, quote, the fact that the best arms on the planet are made by K-words? I'm not going to say that word, but you know what's going on there. So again, like there's a lot of Jew hate getting stirred up in these comics. In part 3, in Hellblazer number 166, we get back to Marjorie, who, having a conversation with Constantine, lets him know, quote, the people that are destroying that was once great about it meaning the US, and teaching us to hate ourselves through their media are one and the same, the Jews. And she starts claiming that nobody screams equality more than Jews. And Constantine, being a smartass, then asks, who does she hate more, blacks or Jews? To which Marjorie responds that it's sort of a silly question. She doesn't hate any of God's creatures. It would be a sin to hate God's creatures. So she doesn't hate black people, even though she doesn't like them. But she does hate the Jews because Satan created the Jews. They are not God's creations. So that's the stuff that, yeah, I mean, again, this prompted like, I don't know, for whatever reason, I felt compelled. It's like all the stuff is in the storyline. I wanted to acknowledge it and bring it up. And also, like, this is not the Jewish content I ever want to be covering. But like, Henry, obviously it's horrific. You didn't know any of this. Like, we decided that I was just going to tell you, describe this to you blind. How is this sitting with you?
I'm like sickened by like it really makes me like not like Brian Azzarello. Like I already was kind of not such a fan because he was pretty not polite at a con when I met him once. And that kind of turns me off.
Yeah,
Even if I
I know
really
what you
like
mean.
their writing, it just kind of makes me like
Yeah,
because there's so many nice
yeah,
writers and artists, you know. So anyway, yeah, just it's blah. It makes me feel sick. I don't like
yeah.
stuff. And it's not, and I was thinking like it's not Jewish content. Like just to put the word Jew in something, it doesn't make it Jewish content.
Right. So the bigger question for us will be, is this issue that we are covering officially, quote unquote, is this Jewish content or not?
Mhm.
So Henry, why don't you give us the details for the conclusion of the storyline of Highwater?
This is Hellblazer number 167, October 2001, Highwater conclusion. Written by Brian Azzarello, penciled and inked by Marcelo Frusin, colored by Zylonol, lettered by Clem Robbins, edited by Will Dennis.
Here we are. Wolfman, the arms dealer I was describing earlier, the neo Nazis decided to kill him, and it was a big problem earlier. I didn't mention this part earlier, but basically, what happens is Constantine. He's pretending to be friends with the neo Nazis, and he offers to help them out by like burying the body to take care of it. And so we don't know what he does. We know Constantine takes the body, and now here we are on page 3. The body of Wolfman has returned from the grave with glowing red eyes, and in Hebrew letters this time, not in English,
Mhm.
the word Emmet on his forehead. Wolfman, the arms dealer, has been turned into the golem.
I gotta say, this is an awesome looking golem. Like this might
It
be
is,
the coolest
yeah,
golem so far.
it is so creepy looking. It's like the golem if the golem was a zombie almost.
I
Yeah,
love how it has pants that are unbuttoned and unzippered. Like what's go,
yeah.
it's ready to
Well,
go.
I think it's from the state he was in when the neo Nazis beat him up and killed him. Right, it's
Okay.
like the ragged sort of version of him, and you
Okay.
can kind of see that like they had like carved words into his chest and things like that. So
Right.
it's there.
Right.
But
Right.
apparently, by taking a dead body and inscribing Emmett in it, Constantine has made Wolfman into a golem, and the golem is basically going to spend the issue kicking those neo Nazis' ass. On page 6, as Constantine is talking to Mr. Gage, the guy sort of in charge, um, Constantine notes that Jews really are God's chosen people. And he says you can tell God likes them because God messes with them the way a kid kicks the family dog. Not
Hmm.
sure I love that comparison, but interesting to hear.
Hmm.
But as Constantine keeps needling them, he says, tell me, where are the Jews now? Israel. After centuries of persecution, they finally got their own country. Why? On the next page, Constantine claims it's because of Hitler. The Jews wouldn't have their bleeding promised land if it weren't for Hitler. Um, you know, I think Constantine is describing a common thought, which is that like the world sort of support for the country of Israel came in part 3 years after the Holocaust, and that like the devastation that the Jewish people received leading up to it was part of what led to Israel being recognized by the UN, even though everything that I've ever learned talk like Israel did not magically come into being because of the Holocaust, right? I actually think it's really dangerous to keep up that mentality. There was so much history and work and sort of like efforts to build the country leading up to and beyond it. But right, Constantine's pointing out this sort of dramatic irony or this irony, and basically claiming like basically you hated these people, your hero Hitler hated these people and tried to kill them, and actually what ended up happening to them, they ended up being given their own country and returning to their homeland. And then, having finished all that, at the end of the issue, page 19, the Golem slowly approaches Constantine. Constantine's happy with the job done, erases the Aleph, and says, "Good night, sweet Golem." And the Golem falls once again to its death inert. And that's it. Very
Mm-hmm.
short. I don't know if I'd say short and sweet, but very short. There's definitely some element of Jewish content there. What do we think, Henry?
You know, I actually, because I didn't read those other ones, I actually really kind of like this one as its own thing in sort of the way that I like the Batman one. Like it's just really cool looking golem, interesting. Like the idea of Constantine, like Constantine's always doing stuff he's not supposed to do, right? He's an
Yeah,
anti-hero. He's Stone
yeah,
Cold Steve Austin, right? So and that's the part of the fun of him. He says whatever he wants. He's always smoking, but he's also like not alive. But he has all these powers, and he gets his ass kicked sometimes. He's cool. I don't know. I kind of like the idea of Constantine just making a golem,
yeah, absolutely.
even though under normal circumstances I wouldn't like that. For some reason, it's funny to me, and
Yeah,
he's kind of good at it. So
yeah.
I actually didn't hate this one as much as the previous one, but knowing all of that lead up, maybe I'd rethink that.
I mean, it's really discomforting because I think what it's clear that Azzarrello is doing is he's building up and making these neo-Nazis worse and worse and worse so that you can have the like it's a revenge story, right? Like it's ultimately a sort of like this hate doesn't get you anywhere. This is going to be a problem. The question is it exploitative, the level to which Azzarello kind of goes into some of their really grotesque, like neo-Nazi white supremacist philosophy. Um,
The
I
answer is
do
yes.
like right. I do though like the core story concept of these neo-Nazi punks killed a man because they didn't like that he was selling them guns from Israel. And then like that man's corpse becomes the golem that like gets revenge. Like there's something cool in that twist on the golem legend, as you said,
Hmm.
and the
Hmm.
sort of transgressive way that Constantine is just like. I also like that Constantine is this blonde haired, probably like kind of Aryan looking British guy who's involved in the cult, who's like taking advantage of that to, trick the neo Nazis into
Oh, I
thinking,
love
oh,
it.
I'm gonna take care of this. I'm gonna like look out because right, the neo Nazis killed him and left him sort of like hanging, like you like Wolfman was lynched from a tree. So
Right.
it's sort of like the older man is like, oh, idiots, we're gonna get in trouble for this, and that's why Constantine's like, oh, I'll take care of this. And I love the secret reveal that like what Constantine did was somehow transform the corpse into a golem. Like that part's awesome. Yeah, it's just like it's full of some really, really gross stuff. And I mean, I
Mm.
agree with you, Henry. It's not Jewish content, and I hate it, and it's odious. And also, like, I don't know, every now and then I'm like, well, the scary thing is there are people out there who believe this. And
Hmm.
and in a way, I'd rather know that this is the crap that they believe and preach than have no idea.
Yeah, it does. It feel with the previous issue too. It feels exploitive. It's yucky. These are good writers. They don't need Nazis and golems to mix to write good stories. Like I don't like it. It the things that are said about these two guys that I don't 100% agree with. I It kind of makes me wonder if their writing is as good as I remember it, because if they're, like I said, they're basically good writers, so they should at a very basic level be able to write a story that doesn't have to include all that like, gross stuff about neo-Nazis. Like we get it, Nazis don't like Jews. Like you don't also have to put in all of that horrible language and imagery. And
Right, right, right.
Brandon, I think if we came across something like this again, like if there was another Golem story that involved the Holocaust in the comic, I don't think, I mean, unless that Golem is wearing a tallis and davening Shacharit, Mincha, and Mariv and reading Torah, like I don't think it counts as Jewish content anymore at this point. Like if like a new
Right.
Golem story came, that it had the
Yeah, I
same
hear
thing.
what you're saying. Right. There wouldn't be a rush. Like we'd probably acknowledge the fact that it happens, but we wouldn't need to dive into it as like must cover material.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's it's so tough because it's like you, I started with that Hellblazer issue and just read the part four. And what I found is like, oh, where did this like I had so many questions about where the golem came from. I didn't understand. It did like I just knew, oh, there's this issue of Hellblazer that has a golem. Let's check it out. So I went back and wanted to read the entirety of it, which, once I
You're
read it, I
such a
was like,
good comic book reader, Brandon. You're such a loyal comic reader. You had to see how the whole story unfolded.
it's look, I both love diving in and having no clue what's going on, and I love then filling in those gaps.
Right.
But right, part of the problem is, you come across that, and I guess in a way, I was so horrified by what I discovered in those first three issues. I was like, well, I don't think it's Jewish content, but I also feel like it provides important context for what's happening in that final issue.
Mhm.
Um, but let's go back, Henry. Let's end by returning to a simpler time. 1991, the same year that we had those wonderful Detective Comics issues. We've got a bit of a different treat. Henry, what are we closing with?
Yeah, we're closing with the Superboy TV show. Just to give you a little background of it, Superboy, according to Wikipedia, was an American TV series based on the fictional DC comic character Superman in his early years as Superboy. The show ran from 1988 to 1992 in syndication, so you could see it all over the country at different times. It was renamed The Adventures of Superboy at the start of the third season. Fun little fact: this ran for 4 seasons, as I said. It had two different Superboys in it. The first season, Superboy was replaced by a new Superboy. So it started with John Hames Newton and was replaced by Gerard Christopher. So even back then, the replacing Superman for a newer Superman was a thing. Um,
Yeah, I feel like it was probably more common in those like early 90s. These
right.
Henry, I had no idea that this TV show existed. It was a complete surprise to me. Like my earliest, I'm aware of like earlier Superman stuff and the Superman movies, but like I grew up with the first Superman property I was aware of was Lois and Clark, right?
Right, right.
Like that's what I grew up with. And then after that, Smallville. I had no idea that there was a live action Superboy TV show.
Superboy is basically considered like the father of Lois and Clark. Like Lois and Clark happened because they liked Superboy, but felt like they just had to like turn it up a little bit, make it more a little
Yeah.
adulty. But it ran for 4 seasons. It was actually pretty popular. It came at a weird time. It was coming off of Superman 4, the last Christopher Reeve film. So it was sort of like nodding to it in terms of design, but it was also post crisis. So it was using some Silver Age stuff, some modern age stuff as like a framework, but it was basically, and it was also basically Smallville because it was Clark and Lana in college in Florida for some reason, mostly because it was filmed in Orlando,
That's
and
so
and
funny.
they did like great stories, like they did Bizarro, they had a long running Lex Luthor, they did Mr. Mixpidolix in like live action. And this was a 22-minute show. Like it was like a weekly Superman show for under 30 minutes. And it was it was just like this great thing as a little kid to have.
Wild. Well, let's go in. So we're,
All right.
as you said, we're season three, episode 14. Let's learn about it.
This is Superboy season 3, episode 14, The Golem. Its air date was January 19, 1991, directed by Robert Weimer and written by Paul Steubenrauch. An elderly Jewish man creates the mythical creature Golem to protect him from racial bigotry. But when Golem goes on a rampage, Superboy has to step in and save the day. So the
We have
episode,
heard this plot.
yes, does it sound familiar, folks? So it opens with these two men walking down the street. Levi, a down and out writer, talks with his manager friend Jonah about his poor misfortune. He says, you write, and Jonah says, you write books about mysticism and the Dark Ages. That's just not relevant anymore. And other than being named Levi and having some other sort of coded Jewish things, like the other guy being named Jonah and sort of a Eastern European New York accent-ish, there's not really much Jewish stuff that happens, but
Well, like you said, it's in Florida, so I just assume that it's
right.
all a bunch of Jews that have moved down there.
Right, exactly. So
Yeah.
Levi and Jonah witness a local shop being vandalized, and Levi has sort of the Kahanist attitude. You've got to fight hate with hatred. And his manager Jonah says, have our people survived for thousands of years so that our people can become them? And Levi
Great
responds with,
question.
it is a great question, yeah. And Levi
Yeah.
responds with thousands of years of persecution. It's time we fought back. I've been working on a way to do it. So like,
And
it's it's actually some like really interesting conversations opening up this episode.
and we've seen this dichotomy a number of times, right? Like this is the dichotomy of Mark Spector Moon Knight versus his father, right? His father being the like we would need to be better than them and we need to not hate, and Moon Knight being like no, like we can't just sit down, right? Like
Right.
we've often seen this with superhero comics where there is a hero that's like we can't just sit down and take this.
Yeah, it's that age old story. To have it in like a this standalone episode is like really interesting.
Yeah.
So Levi goes into his dark basement and he sets up a candelabra. Could be Shabbat type menorah type stuff. It's three sticked, so you
Yeah,
know,
I feel like it was just like an aesthetic, like ooh,
yeah.
mystical candles.
Right,
Yeah,
right. I mean, if it's three though, yeah, he could have used it at his Shabbos table for all we know. So
sure.
he starts shaping some clay. He puts on a yarmulke and shapes the clay into a man. He chants some hard to hear dialogue in Hebrew, but I definitely heard Baruch atah Adonai. Did you hear anything that you recognized other than just sort of vague Hebrew?
This is the part where it's like bad homework. I would definitely watch this, and I do not recall
Yeah,
what he
no,
was
it's not bad
muttering.
homework.
Yeah,
I wondered if that was something that stood out to you.
yeah. I mean, like, yeah, I recall that he kind of had it. Makes me wonder if like they had it written out, or if they just had a Jewish actor and was just like, I don't know, just mumble some Hebrew at different points.
I was wondering the same exact thing because
Yeah.
it's weird, like with the kind of with the way TV works, like he was doing something else, you weren't seeing him, so it was definitely a voiceover because the camera's panning over the scene as those words are being said, and then you
Mm,
see him. So it's obviously been dubbed. So it's like you don't can always tell, and so like to have it be like it was like Baruch atah Adonai. So I think more the latter, what you said.
nice. Yeah.
So the golem starts to the clay starts to crack, which was kind of a cool effect to see the golem coming out of a cracked like a shell, like a
Yeah, that was really interesting. I'd never seen that.
hadn't
Yeah.
seen that before, and comes to life. The golem comes to life and sneaks up behind him, and Levi starts to remove pieces of clay to reveal a human man. So
Yeah, this is basically like if you can imagine when like there's a mummy covered in bandages and then they unwrap and there's something underneath, but instead this was like or in Ghostbusters when the two characters get turned into those like stone dogs, right?
yes,
And then
yes,
like
it's
they
exactly
break
what it's
this
like.
and then they break the stone at the end and Rick Moranis like
Sigourney
crawls
Weaver.
out, right? And Sigourney Weaver crawl out.
Yes.
Like that's what it felt like. It's like there's this or I guess like now I'm thinking of the cartoon Gargoyles also. But basically there was like this hardened clay, it gets shattered, and then there's just like a human man inside.
Yeah, like this hot guy with big muscles and wavy
Very,
90s hair.
very like Arnold chic, very what was
Yeah.
it that we read in Batman last year? Like, oh, a Jewish Schwarzenegger?
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah. But I mean, clearly it's just a cost saving like TV show of the week. We don't have the budget to have a walking golem. We're just gonna have a guy come out of clay.
totally.
Totally
But
works.
like really fascinating wrinkle on the Golem legend to
Mhm.
imagine, oh, what would it be like if it's not just this thing out of clay, but like
Right.
the
A
clay
shapeshifter.
turned into right, or it's like, yeah, it started from clay, but then it becomes basically indistinguishable from human beings, other than the fact like is a little too big and a little too muscly.
Yeah, exactly. So Levi says, "Listen to me. I am your creator. Your only purpose is to rid the world of bigots, annihilated, crushed. I will tell you who these people are." And so,
Yeah,
yeah, that's where we get
crush the bigots.
right. So we cut to Levi's manager. Now, just to explain a little bit, no surprise, Clark and Lana work at the local newspaper. It's the small paper, and they have an editor. It's not Perry White, it's some other guy. Anyway, uh, Jonah's at the paper, and he's talking to the editor and Lana and Clark about Levi. He's like worried that Levi's going to do something. And you hear him spelling it Golem, Golem. Yeah, they're supposed to have enormous strength to protect the Jews in the Middle Ages. Levi's always been interested in the Kabbalah. It's a collection of ancient Jewish mysticism that also tells how to make a golem. And so
Sure,
yeah, that's
fine.
like a nice summary. That's fine.
Although, like, it's interesting that they call it like the Middle Ages, because I guess it's like just after the Middle Ages. I don't know.
Yeah,
I feel
it's
like,
not the Middle Ages.
yeah, Golem legends are definitely more from the Maharal, which is like in the 1500s, but I think that's like after the end for sure. Yeah.
Right,
Anyway,
right. It's okay though. It's fine, but he's like basically saying he's afraid that is going to do something drastic to rid the neighborhood of these neo-Nazi kids. And I really enjoyed, you know me, Brandon, like I really enjoyed seeing Clark Kent listening to this tale about the Golem and just going, writing things down, like
yeah,
being very
yeah,
Clark Kenty
absolutely.
while hearing about a Jewish thing. It just, made me happy.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's neat to see him anytime Superman is aware of Jewish stuff. It's just like, that's cool.
It's nice, yeah.
Yeah.
So Clark asks, how can someone tell the difference? And Jonah responds, the Hebrew sign of life. He writes in perfect Hebrew, chai, and says, it would be right over his heart. So here's obviously a
Now,
play on the Emmett thing. No, did I get that
yeah,
wrong?
this one. No, I was gonna say
Yeah.
100% has to be the needs of this TV show making it, because like I don't know of any version of the Golem legend where high gets used where it's over the chest instead of the forehead. Like, also like, spoiler alert, there's going to be something that happens at the end of the episode that like clearly they're setting up for.
Right. Yeah.
Uh,
No, and also
but
like they can't have it if he's going to be a human guy, they have to make it something that's concealable so that he's not walking around with like an Emmet on his forehead. So
I
they put it
mean,
on
these
his
days in
chest.
2024, I think you could do it. It's like we have people who have tattoos on their faces.
It's like, is that the Golem? No, it's Post Malone.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
So a neo-Nazi is bothering a local Jew and says, "You're that." He's bothering Levi. And he says, "You're that Jew writer. We hate your kind most of all." And
Yeah, they hate writers. They're so anti-literature.
he's an anti-writer. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the golem chokes him and beats up the rest of them. The golem all of a sudden is out of control and hits Levi by mistake and kills him. So once again,
Oh,
Brandon, we're seeing the thing where the golem tragically kills its own creator. Not this time by falling on it, but by striking him and he breaks his neck or
yeah, yeah. Which is also we've seen versions of the legend, right?
yeah.
Remember in the Batman one, only the creator could destroy the Golem, and it's like, oh, what would happen in this case? But thankfully, it's playing around differently. Yeah, like what a tragedy of the Golem destroying its creator. Like, yeah,
And
horrific.
and I get the like you have 22 minutes to make us care about this, so we got to kill this
Right.
nice old Jew. But again, he didn't need that. He could have been put in the hospital or something. Like
Sure. Yeah.
kill the Jew. Like okay, it's like the it's like the just dispensable Jewish
It
character.
it is a little cleaner than the show having to deal with like what are the legal responsibilities of this guy who did summon a murderous
I
rampaging
guess.
monster.
I guess. So
Like, look,
yeah.
I hate neo Nazis are awful, regardless. But like, for the most part, at least in the show, all they've been doing is like breaking into shops, right, and
Right.
being like awful. Like I don't know if that warrants death,
Right,
right?
right. Well, that's right. They're kind of like the local like neighborhood gang that's annoying everyone, kind of. Yeah.
Yes, right. And like I'm sure part of that is just like the nature of the show that's not going into right, like they're just kind of this annoying neighborhood gang as opposed to right, like lynching people or something like
Right,
that.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, it's a kids show, sort of. Yeah. So the Golem's now out of control. He beats up cops because he's confused by their uniforms because it looks very similar to the neo-Nazis.
I
Clark, he's
mean,
not
I
wrong.
mean,
Clark disappears. Obviously, Superboy appears. They fight. The Golem gets away. So the neo Nazis are meeting, and I actually found this part really funny. They're reading Mein Kampf. Like, way to stick to the source material, guys.
it's so funny because it's almost like I just think about it in comparison. It's like, and every Shabbos the Jews get together to read from the Torah, and every whatever night of the week it is, the neo Nazis get together to read from Mein Kampf, and
Right.
it's just like, are they just a really aggressive book club that is like, we love this piece of hatred literature?
Yeah.
Kind of.
It's kind of like cartoony, like you'd see it on The Simpsons or something. Like a
Right, like the idea of actually reading from Mein Kampf at at a like
right,
a neo-Nazi meeting, like
right.
I don't, yeah,
So Superboy, of course, goes in to warn them, and here we get about the Golem, and here we get that like thing like, I may not agree with you, but you have a right to blah blah, do whatever. I have to
yeah,
he says something to the effect of, I have to protect everyone, including repulsive people. So
right.
okay, fine. Lana's out looking for the Golem, and because that's what Lana does, or Lois does, whatever. And Clark finds her, and they follow the man who caused a distraction while the Golem escaped. And he's
Right. So just to make sure it's clear, basically there's this big episode with the golem, he's attacking all sorts of things, and then there's this man who causes a big distraction. The golem escapes, and it's like,
right.
who is this stranger that appeared?
Right, he's sort of, yeah, he just sort of shows up, and he's like just as
Yeah.
tall as the Golem. And so he says, there's only one way to stop a Golem: remove the mark over his heart. The
Right. It's
Golem's
basically like now Lana and Clark have their new mentor in the form of this like expert golem hunter, basically.
Yeah, it's sort of like giving Van Helsing, Giles from
Yes.
Buffy vibes, except
That
also like
yes.
huge and ripped and could like kick everyone's ass.
Yeah. It would be like if you were fighting a vampire and then Blade showed up and was just
Right,
like,
right,
get out of
right,
my
right,
fight.
right.
Yeah.
So the Golem, of course, now can read and finds the ad for the neo-Nazi march, and he finds them and starts beating them up, and and a fire starts, and all of a sudden the mysterious man sort of talks the Golem out of killing one of the neo-Nazis who was a kid. Of course, they had like a little Hitler Youth there, and Golem's going crazy, and so that strange man talks him out of it, and Golem burns away his mark and says,
Yeah.
Shalom. So the Chai on his chest, he burns it away and says, Shalom. And he crumbles to dust right before Superboy's eyes. I think Lana is conveniently not there, and the building explodes, and he returns to Clay 4. So the big reveal at the end of the episode is that the mysterious man is also a golem and has a chai on his chest, and he's just sort of
Yeah,
this
I like that
wandering
little switch.
superhero golem.
It made me like desperately wish for there to be more episodes with them because it's such a cool, like, what a cool concept of like we know the legends of the golems that end up going out of control and like growing in rage, and like the idea of this one golem that got it together and is trying to be as human as can be and is taking it as mission to be like, golems are generally well intentioned but they sometimes get like they go off path, and like I'm
Right.
there to correct them, right, like
I like it. They kind of
cool,
stumbled onto like a cool idea.
such a
He
cool
never comes
concept.
back. He's never a reoccurring character, unfortunately. I mean, but that I would kind of like spin off a comic from this, like,
100%. You give me a story about this like
like sort of the Hulk vibes of
ancient,
like going from town to town, or the Kung Fu, the legend continues.
Eternally youthful, but turns
Right.
out it's been around for centuries. Golem that has taken it upon itself to like snip in the bud any mystical practices that brought Jewish demons and monsters and golems to life, right? Like you could see it expanding, right? Like not only taking care of other golems, but also like, oh, there's a Dybbuk that this thing's going after. Oh, there's right, like 100% I would read this story or watch this show.
You could do it like over centuries, like you remember like the Buffy episodes that were always so good when they flash back to like Spike
Flashback to
in
Angelus when he first got turned. Yeah, yeah,
yeah, or
yeah.
Spike when he was in at different times,
Yep, yep.
when he was like a punk in London in the 80s and
Oh
stuff
my
like
God, what a great concept! Like seeing the golem at its worst, seeing it at its best, like how
yeah.
it learned to be responsible now. Oh my God, I gotta. No one listening to this, take this, Henry. We got to do something with this idea.
Yeah. So this was great. I mean, I really enjoyed it. It was just a good Superboy episode that had some nice. I was really happy. It had some nice things, and I was really happy to end with that because I was feeling really down about the last two comics.
Absolutely, yeah. Again, it was a better example of how to deal with like the golem story is so much richer in conversation with neo Nazis in terms of like I don't know, like there's some versions of the conversation that feel much better. And this is like not as good as the Detective Comics story that we covered last episode, but this one definitely felt, as you said, much better than the Swamp Thing one. Or I really am starting to wonder if just some of those comics writers from the early 2000s that I used to love when I was in high school are just kind of like little edgy guys that are not as good as I once thought. Like it
Yeah.
impressed me then, but I'm really fascinated by the fact that that Superboy episode was in January '91, and then the Golem of Gotham story arc was in the summer of '91. Like it's
Mm.
really fascinating to me because there's so many beats of the stories that are so similar, and
Hmm.
obviously the difference between Batman and Superman and how they deal with it, but like Jewish man who feels persecuted, who's tired of seeing neo Nazis destroy storefronts or places of worship of other religions, right? Like builds a golem and tells the golem to fight. And like we saw the golem resisting, we saw the golem not wanting to listen to Saul. We saw the golem, accidentally killing Levi. Like they were just very similar storylines.
Yeah, and the Superboy, like it was pretty simple, but it had like some little wrinkles here and there that were very original, and it didn't feel played out. The subject matter didn't feel played out because it had enough things that were different, um, to sort of highlight the positives of it.
Yeah, and I think as you said, because it's this low budget, early 90s, late 80s TV show, I think some of the changes to the Golem lore that came about because of budgetary constraints, I have more empathy for or sympathy
Yes.
for because it's like, okay, like, necessity is the mother of invention. They had to get creative, which feels, I don't know why in the comic books where there's sort of like infinite budget, you don't really have to worry about these things. A lot of it just felt lazy, or I didn't really understand why certain shifts or changes were made. Like this actually felt more reverent to the Golem material, even though, right, like the high on the chest, very different than the Emmet. But I was like, that's a cool wrinkle,
Yeah.
probably because the idea of the high and it meaning life is like, well, you had to know something about Judaism and Hebrew to do that.
Right. Yeah. Very cool. I really enjoyed it.
Very cool stuff. Well, getting back and saying, I think, we're in the position that we, anti-Semitism alone is definitely not Jewish content. It's interesting to see it brought in to sort of highlight the Jewish content that comes. But, as fun as it's been spending time with our protector, the Golem, I'm a little ready to leave this character behind us now,
Yes.
or this comic behind, and
Yes.
move on to whatever might be next.
Yeah.
Thanks as always for listening, everybody. And until next time, I'm Brandon Bernstein.
I'm Henry Bernstein.
No
No
relation.
relation.
Thanks for listening. You can follow us at Jewish Comics Pod on Facebook and Twitter, or you can email us at jewishcomicspodcast@gmail.com. Please don't forget to give us a rating, and you can hit the subscribe button if you haven't already.